So ethical decision making are our actions, our values, our beliefs. It's integrated into all that we do to prepare people to do their jobs, from the custodian to the university president. Like, we're all faced with ethical decisions at maybe not daily, but probably daily. Like, we're all making decisions based on things we see, things we hear, situations that we're in. And I think part of the issue with ethics is that people really struggle with is there is not a right and wrong. We think of ethics as right, wrong, black, white, and that's so not what ethics is. And there's just no way to say if you're unethical if you do this and you're ethical if you do this, because we all have different, value systems, morals that align our beliefs and guide our decision making.
It may very well be one of the most important skills that you develop in your life, ethical decision making. Welcome to The Search Bar. I'm your host, Adam Sparks, and on today's episode, we're talking about the importance and the impact of our everyday decisions with Ann Hornak, professor of higher education at Central Michigan University. Hi, Ann. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
I'm excited too. I'm always interested in these types of conversations because I feel like there's like this really tangible, functional value to ethics. Mm-hmm. And then there's also kind of this mushy, esoteric, like understanding of kind of what ethics are and how we develop them or function with them rather, as individuals or as kind of parts of a system that we might be, when we're working there, we're in service to that system, whether it's a country or an ideology or something like that. I guess the best way to start this is probably to kind of ask, what are ethics? What is ethical decision making to you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so ethical decision making are our actions, our values, our beliefs. Mm-hmm. They underscore everything that we do at a university. So if we think about leadership and the decisions that are made that have a domino effect for faculty, for staff, and most importantly, students. But there's also decisions that are made on college campuses that impact the community in which they reside. Mm-hmm. Ethics are part of all of those. And I would argue that we don't pay enough attention to the ethics of the consequences of some of our decision making in an ethical frame. We're always very focused on a legal frame, like nobody wants to get sued, and we live in a really litigious society. Yeah. But we don't always think about like what are the unintended consequences, which usually have like a moral bearing or some sort of ethical consequence to them.
So, for me, ethics is sort of like I think this. I'm going to use a really dumb example and feel free to correct me because you're the expert. I think of it as like sort of like a knight who wears a coat of arms, right? Like there's kind of rules and honor that comes with doing that. I'm talking like a fantasy world here. I'm not going to pretend to know that much about how medieval fiefdoms were run in particular. But the idea of like there's like this kind of self-sacrificing thing, or like I might do something because I know that it's right for the society or the rules system or the honor that is in place, but it might not be the thing I always want to do, right? Is that how you see it? Or
yeah, I think sometimes. So this happens a lot at like religiously affiliated institutions that have strong ties to religious values. And so I teach in student affairs. We prepare students to be college student administrators. And student affairs professionals and student affairs educators. And when we're talking about job search, I always say to them, listen, you have to think about how your values align. And I get at the end of the day, you need to find a job to pay the bills. Like there's some necessity there and some functionality in there. You're getting a master's degree to go and do that. But if you're, casting a really wide net at institution, you want to think about institutional type. And institutions that have really strong religious ties. And we have lots of institutions that were founded on religious, tenets, but their affiliation with the church now is just loose or really non-existent. But there are institutions that their values may not align to the values of the institution. So I'm not going to name institutions, but think about like Catholic institutions that are really Catholic, evangelical institutions that have rules about governing student life that may or may not align with the new professional, and there's conflict there. I also think that even as a faculty member, I struggle sometimes with decisions that the university makes about students, so student fees, the kind of rules that govern students, because I question they might be ethical, but is it really the right thing to do? Like, right. Is this really how we want to do business? Like, what are the consequences of these, and who's being marginalized by these? Because you can make ethical decisions that do marginalize people.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's kind of like that's the one of those famous, like, the ethical quandaries. It's like the trolley problem, things like that, which I don't want to.
Pharmaceutical,
yeah. I was going to say the other version of the trolley problem is once if they don't die, do you? Do you kind of, at what point is if we have to do something that's unethical for the greater good and it's going to marginalize a small amount of people, is it really, are those good ethics or not? Right. That's kind of a difficult.
It is.
There's a lot of quandaries there too. I think that's one of the things that are interesting about ethics is there isn't always a right or wrong answer sometimes, but that's why, like, as like an institution like here at Central Michigan University, like, we hope there's some ethics that we all kind of agree on, or that we agree that we're going to adhere to them.
Absolutely.
Because you may not agree with every principle that the university lays out, but we sort of have to collectively be on the same page. That's kind of that. Yeah. The Knight's Honor type thing where you kind of go, all right, I don't like this one, but I'm going to do it so we're all in line with the same rules, sort of.
And I think part of the issue with ethics is that people really struggle with is there is not a right and wrong. We think of ethics as right, wrong, black, white, and that's so not what ethics is. And there's just no way to say if you're unethical if you do this and you're ethical if you do this, because we all have different, value systems, morals that align our beliefs and guide our decision making. So we have to live in that gray area, which is really hard for people to live in that gray area. And it's not clean and it's not neat. And we also have to remember that we make ethical decisions based on the best information we have at that moment in time. Well, we may learn, information may change, and we have to go back and revise our decisions or reassess. And that's where I think we get into a little bit of trouble. We don't always do that. Like, oh, we made this decision, now we're going to stick to it.
Yeah.
But we learn new information. Like, COVID is a really good example of kind of all the ethical pitfalls of, we thought it was a really good idea to just say to students, and I'm not picking on any one institution, but go home. Like, we're not going to have communal living. There's going to be no residents, living. It also happened to happen on most spring recesses, so students were away. And I know I've talked to enough students to know that when you went on spring recess, you didn't take your entire backpack and all your books and all your, you may not even take your laptop. So to say you can't get anything out of your room, or but we have students that don't have safe spaces to go to. They didn't have quiet spaces. They didn't have Wi-Fi in their homes. They didn't live in state. We grounded all airlines. We have international students. I mean, on and on and on. Like, we didn't think through this decision, but then we kept amending these decisions as information came in. And, it was almost the yo-yo of, like, decision making. And I think in some ways people cast it as, like, these were really kind of decisions that were sort of ripe for ethical analysis now in hindsight. At the time, I don't know that, like, could we have done better? You can always do better, but could we have? Like, the CDC information was coming out as fast as we were making decisions. So.
I think that's a really good example, and it's probably, at least for most folks, more relatable than the trolley problem. You can Google it; it's everywhere. It's like every ethics professor's first day of class, right? Yeah. But I feel like that's a really great example of kind of that, like, where do my ethics and my morals kind of come from? Which one's informing which? Because early in the pandemic, you're right, we didn't have a lot of information, so making an ethical decision was difficult, because the idea of ethics is, again, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, is that I'm using logic to develop these ethics.
Yep.
we just knew something scary was happening. We had such little information that we made more of a moral decision, which was like, let's just stay completely away from each other in these big institutions. And whether that was
safety.
Yeah. And it was in those moral decisions that we make, and look, not everyone was on board with that. Obviously, I think there's concessions to be made about how effective it was, but those moral decisions, they're not usually rooted in logic, right? You were talking about like religious institutions too. Like a lot of us grow up with some morality that's derived from our parents, from the church that we go to, from or wherever you may worship,
communities,
from the community that you live in, and we don't question those. They're not derived out of logic, right? You just they just are. Right. And one of those things I think is kind of personal safety is, you want to get way down the ethical train, is it's one of those things that sort of strips you of free will. You start making decisions that are just like, I don't want to die. Yeah. Yeah. And it might not actually be logical because it's just self-preservation. And I do think the early pandemic, a lot of decisions were made with low information and high reactivity. And that's
And then that, like, I don't want to die, but I also don't want to, like, I'm a caregiver. I live in a multi-generational home. All those things that we learned in hindsight, and we were sending students like almost into the fire of, well, I know your 102-year-old grandma lives with you and you just, spent some time, in this space. And we didn't think, like, we looked at students not in holistic ways early in the pandemic and all the other sort of elements of their life. And I think that was our ethical blinders at the time, was because no other time do we look at students as just sort of living in a hall, in a communal living. We always think of them as holistically, like they don't come to classes and come to campus without all of their traumas and their baggage. And, we work through that, but we sort of suspended that during the pandemic because we were, I can't quite explain why. Yeah. And I mean, I was not a decision maker, so I'm not. Me either.
Yeah, I feel like you're right though. That's like, it is exactly that thing where, like, in hindsight, if we apply like a logical ethic to it, not all the students, but a lot of students, given the way people who are between 18 and 24, like, I have teenagers. When my kids got COVID, it was like, my nose itches. Like, there was nothing to it. And that was a lot of the students here. I know even students that work for me or younger people that worked in my office, they got in like, well, I had kind of a cold. Yeah. Me, I was destroyed for 7 days when I first got it. And because I'm older, I think, and as you're right, as it turns out, like, they probably would have been fine living here. And in fact, may have posed less risk to the middle-aged and elderly people that they would encounter probably in higher frequency in their communities than they do here. But yeah, that's an interesting, I think, way to kind of to frame that. So hopefully people sort of get the difference between our ethics and just kind of our moral immediate decision making. So
one of the unintended consequences, and this is why I use COVID, is we now have we had a mental health crisis. We now have a bigger mental health crisis because we now understand the ethics of, or the power of socialization and social beings. And I think that's where we really, like, the ethical train derailed, is we never thought about, like, we create all these amazing co-curricular opportunities, and we talk about sense of belonging, and we talk about community so much, and we create these for students, and all of a sudden we took all those away, and we didn't, I mean, yes, okay, we tried to do these like wonky, Zoom things and these social, but we never had conversations about those. Now we have a generation that, whether you were in high school, middle school, and it's not just about missing out on things, it was those like foundational social experiences that they're just gone for 2 years. Yes, that just, and we can't get those back. And I mean, I think about my own children who were in high school and college, and I mean, I'm not sad for them that they missed like those times. I'm sad for them that they have unrealized like social friendships and relationships that are gone. Like, they can't get those back now as they graduate from college and are out doing, their own things. And that's the part I think we need to explore more. Like, what did the decision makers, the consequences of that is huge. And we're going to be feeling that for generations through the trauma and mental health that we have to work through related to the decisions we made about COVID. And that's the hard thing about, I think, thinking about your ethics and where your ethical decision making comes into, because like
we're probably like, and to be clear, like we're talking about this in a revisionist manner. And this is not to say like, oh, every COVID restriction and reaction was wrong. It's that maybe we overcorrected and now we're able to think about that, because I do think one of the things that leads to ethical decision-making is going into that decision-making realizing that you could be wrong. And I think that's probably the hardest thing for people. I know I'm in my 40s now. I never really thought about that much until recent years, where it's like, am I open to being completely wrong about something that I think is ethical and needs to be implemented or needs to be valued? How do people do? I think that's a trick. It's a skill you have to learn, right? How do you do that?
Well, I think good ethical leaders can show weakness and vulnerability and still be strong. So I think we have this narrative around like, what does it mean to be a leader? And strength is always, we can't show weakness, we can't show vulnerability. And I actually think some of our most ethical leaders will get on a platform and say, I was wrong. That was the wrong decision to make. I mean, we're not going to get into politics, but think of all the presidents who made really bad decisions in their legacy, in their time in office that had so many consequences that have been detrimental to, if it had been done differently. I mean, we can't play out like, oh, it looks like this, we can't revise this. And like you said, revisionist history. But,
Back to the future,
But we don't often, have we heard some of these presidents come out and say, I was really wrong. That was just a really bad decision.
It's almost an absolute no in politics, right?
Because it's a sign of weakness. Whereas I think people who operate from, have really strong moral foundation and values and confidence in their decisions because they know that the information they had at that time was good, can say, I was wrong. Like, it's okay. I'm going to change course. I created this. Like, we don't create space for that. Like, we don't create space for any sort of perceived weakness or vulnerability, when I actually think that it's strength. That's a superpower to say, this is,
own it.
Yeah.
Own it and improve it. Right. That sort of thing. So why then is, why is that important? Like, why is having more people who are able to kind of bring themselves through that ethical decision-making process or bring it to organizations? What's where's the value gain for us there?
The value gain is, I think we get more transparency. So we have more people who are involved in decision-making. We can't, I always, preach this to my students is we don't make ethical decisions in vacuums. So the president doesn't sit in Warner Hall and make, a big ethical decision without, I hope not, without consulting, trusted people, both on and off campus. Like, good leaders have this sphere of influence of people that help guide them, that they believe in, that challenge them. So, there's great importance of having people that have diverse ideas and thoughts and say, hey, no, that's so off base. Think about it this way. And, that's super important because it leads to transparency. So when we can see why decisions were made, it also breeds confidence in our leaders. It creates a culture of trust. It just creates like goodwill, and people want to be part of something like that. So this is a big one in higher ed because leadership changes so often. I think the average college presidency was 2 to 3 years, and sometimes there goes the cabinet too. And this is an interesting time at CMU because we have we're not fully interim U, but we have a lot of interim leaders on the cabinet right now. And what happens is that as that institutional knowledge leaves, we have individuals come in interim spots, and so I have to keep the ship afloat and keep moving forward. But there's no time to study what am I actually supposed to be doing? Like what are some decisions that were made that I still have to implement? Because it's not like it's a blank canvas. And those things get missed. And that's when institutions really get into trouble in terms of ethics is, that was 4 administrators ago, had this conversation, it was written down, it was filed away. And you can note time after time after time of these decisions, and I could sit here and cite institutions I'm not going to, but that this has happened to. So it's this. Our legacy issues are in longevity, but the work is hard.
What are some ways that folks can make ethical decisions when they're faced with future problems?
Yeah. So I think, like, as an organization, as an institution, we have to create a culture of ethics. So one is talking about it, giving individuals opportunities. And I mean leadership to everyone. So did you do your ethics training for this semester?
I have not done it yet.
Yeah. Do you, like, when will you do it?
When the busiest parts of the semester slow down.
Yeah. Well, no, there is. I'm joking. Like, there is no. We take Title IX, which I know has ethics.
I'm kind of counting those.
Yeah. We do our fire safety training, right? We do our. We're going to have some new, like, equity and inclusion training that's coming out, which. So maybe besides the fire, like, lots of this is reactive.
Yeah.
We could do, if we think about, like, how do we create a culture of ethics at an institution, is putting this, like, it's part of onboarding. It's integrated into all that we do to prepare people to do their jobs, from the custodian to the university president. Like, we're all faced with ethical decisions at maybe not daily, but probably daily. Like, we're all making decisions based on things we see, things we hear, situations that we're in, things I read in my students' papers. We're all responsible employees. So, like, what does that mean? Does everybody have clarity on, like, what does it mean to keep our students safe? What does it mean to keep our students healthy and in safe environments? Like, those are all embedded in this work and super important. I don't know that it's on the fore, always on our mind, right? When faced with it, we respond. We're probably pretty clunky at it. And I go back to what I said earlier about, like, we're really good with the legal side. Like,
right.
we're really good. Like, we're gonna hone a statement. We're gonna run it through legal counsel, university counsel, to make sure that it is solid and, kind of foolproof. We do this with contracts, that we're not putting the university in jeopardy legally. When do we have that same review of, are we putting the university in jeopardy ethically?
Yeah.
We're not good at that. Like, we don't create those situations. We also have and this is inherent in most universities, a reporting structure that's probably wrought with, like, conflict of interest. It's wrought with different reporting structures. We talk about this a lot in our classes because we prepare student affairs educators to be student affairs educators. Well, there's lots of people that get hired without a master's degree, and then they, get to an institution, and because of the benefits, seek a position, or, seek a master's degree. Well, they could be, one step away from being a supervisor, or have a supervisor-supervisee relationship in class. We've had this before. Or in the residence halls, a really good example is, you're a resident assistant as an undergrad, and then you get hired as a resident director as a grad. And you are literally 6 months away from graduating, having lived with these individuals, and now you have some authority and some power over these individuals. Have you explored all those relationships, talked about those, talked about the dimensions of that and what that might look like, set boundaries? These are all the ways that we can be forward-facing in this, and it's part of our work. Like, these are conversations we have. It's part of onboarding.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because it's like that idea of the going from being an RA to an RHD is kind of an interesting one, just because it's a common path for people who are in education administration. A lot of folks who work at colleges, for those who don't know, so many of them, my first job was RHD. Like, that is a super common path. There's people here who are way up the chain who started as RHDs, because it's a great position to get in and learn how to do some of this stuff. But if you start doing it when you're 25 and you were just living there in the same building sometimes 2 years ago, have you went and done, and I want to be clear, we're not insinuating there's a ton of like problems that are popping up from this, but the moral and the ethical exercise is interesting because going back to that, the morals that you sort of just gain in life without logic, it's hard to go, these aren't my peers anymore.
Right.
Because usually you'll just see people as your peer group and you behave and interact with them in a certain way, probably because it's uncomfortable to detach yourself from that. And how do I detach myself but still maintain some of the personal relationships I have, or the value that I bring to those relationships, but create the structure and the distance that's required for me to maybe give people bad news or tell them what the rules are. Yeah, I think that's a relatable space to put it. I was thinking when you're saying it a little bit about like attorney-client privilege, which there's this space for, and I'm sure I'm using this because everyone's familiar with it, where you may have a client that has done something and has told you they've done something that is morally abhorrent or even illegal, but as an attorney, your ethics are that is privileged information. Like that's kind of the most, I think, well-known and extreme example, but this happens all the time. And the question you sort of start to have is, am I a bad person for not reporting this? And can I continue to be an attorney? These are the ethics that you have to like build into that position. Like, I have a client who's on trial for murder. They told me, I did do the murder, but I'm pleading not guilty. What do you do? Yeah. Because the ethics of that job is that you give them a defense anyway.
Like, what are the limits?
For yourself. Yeah. That's why don't be an attorney. Sorry, pre-law people. Well, I couldn't do it.
And the other thing with university administration that's so interesting related to ethics is we really don't have good reporting structures. So if I sense, Adam, that you're operating in an unethical way, we're all in different disciplines. So I'm going to take faculty, and you're in communications and journalism, and yes, you have journalistic ethics, and I'm in higher ed. Where would I report that? We do have, we used to have an ethics hotline that was, I don't even know if this exists at the university anymore, that someone could kind of report an unethical, action, and then it would be investigated from, an outside, unbiased perspective. Yeah. In higher education, go back to our residence hall example is, and that's not unethical in and of itself. Like a dual relationship is just not unethical in and of itself, but an unmanageable dual relationship is. Yep. But if we sense that the RHD was like not putting up boundaries, not protecting, not actually doing their job related to students and protecting students and creating a safe space and a space where students feel like they belong, and maybe having relations with residents, which is really unethical. We have no reporting structure for that. Some of the professional organizations have like an ethics board, but they don't have any power to then call CMU and say, or U of M or MSU and say, hey, Anne is X, Y, and Z. Like, will that happen? Even the way that we report, we're not the American Bar Association or the American Medical Association, because many of us aren't licensed in, so there's the retributions of that outside of like social workers, teachers. So that's also, I think, makes it really tricky is what are the consequences? How do we check unethical behavior and, make sure that we're kind of aligned in those ways?
Yeah, I think you're onto something that's interesting there too, which is that when you see unethical behavior, or you're trying to process maybe something that in the adversity, like something that is ethical, but you don't really like, but like maybe you understand the logic behind why the decision had to be made, is how do you choose to react, or how do you choose to report, right? And that's a tough thing too, because, we were talking off camera about situations where like victims of crimes and things may not report them because there's moral gray area in them being a victim. Not that I'm assigning to them, they may be assigning to themselves, or society, or societal organizational pressures that they have may assign to them. And it's, to step it back from crime, like victims of crimes, like if you're just in an uncomfortable situation, or you're viewing behavior that you feel like isn't serving the ethics of the institution. Hey, I thought we all agreed that, you know, we're, again, use the university as an example. Not this is happening all the time. I don't think that what you're doing is serving students very well. I think this is the selfish behavior. It is tough to know where to go with it. And then if I say that, then do I put myself under some sort of a review for having said it? That, I mean, that goes into kind of a whole lot of other stuff where, you know, why whistleblower policies and laws should exist in organizations and in societies, but it's tough, right? Like,
and then think about like your longevity at the institution. So we're all in different positions and with different kind of levels of real and perceived influence, or authority, or, you know.
I know. I got a microphone. I have so much authority.
Power.
It's perceived power only.
And it's so depending on where you're at in the organization, that can also like complicate this, is where do I go with this? Am I going to lose my job? What are going to be, you know, what if I'm wrong? What if I didn't see what I didn't hear, what I thought I heard? I only heard part of it. Like, because I think part of what we think about in terms of ethics is you're not the investigator. So, you know, we have to have reporting structures where there's an opportunity for an investigation. So, you know, OCRI serves in that way related to, you know, Title IX. We should be able to turn it over to OCRI or, you know, the Title IX office, compliance office, and then trust that is going to, there's going to be an investigation, but it doesn't always mean that someone's going to call you up and say, hey, Adam, like we did an investigation and this is what we found. I mean, that's unsettling for people too. We have to learn to say, you know, I did everything that I could to protect this individual, and maybe it was a big nothing burger. You know, you don't know. Yeah,
that's the thing. I mean, that again, going back to that idea of like, I could be wrong.
Yeah.
Like sometimes you could be. I mean, where, you know, seeing something that seems fishy isn't always, you know, isn't always an indicator that something's off. Which kind of brings me to my next question, which is moral blind spots. Like, how do you challenge your own moral blind spots? Is there an exercise you can do to identify it? I feel like that's also another one of those really interesting things. Like earlier I was mentioning, like, might I be wrong? Well, if I might be wrong, what is it? Am I admitting to myself what might be influencing me to perceive something inaccurately?
There's actually some really good like bias, unconscious bias training that I would recommend to everyone, which relates to, you know, beginning to identify your blind spots, usually related to identities, others' identities. And it kind of goes on some of our own privileges. So when we have privileges in areas of our identity, you know, I identify as a white person. I have white privilege. What does that mean? Like, what does that mean in terms of my blinders and what I don't see? Because some things are just so normal to me in the way that I identify. So I have to work harder to kind of see some of these maybe injustices or unethical things because I've never lived that. Gender is another one that, you know, if we start doing some of this work related to unconscious bias, I think it begins to, we'll never get rid of our blinders. Like, we're always going to have blinders, but we begin to address those. Like, say, okay, what am I not seeing here? But it also go back to one of your earlier questions about ethical decision making. And I talked about teams and having like consults is, so if you ever go through any like counseling training programs or social work, is one of the things that we talk a lot about. I have a master's degree in counseling is consult. We always consult. So the most ethical leaders are deliberative in their processes. They're deliberative and very intentional about who they surround themselves with. Not just physically, you know, in a cabinet or on campus, but they're trusted like sources are people that will say, hey, Adam, you have like huge, like take those glasses off. You can't see this. You're not seeing this. And you're like, wow, I totally missed that. Or
yeah, it's getting that mentorship that kind of isn't from your world perspective, maybe that can sort of help out. Yeah, I think that's tough. There's a content creator online that I enjoy. It's like an entertainment person and woman. And I was watching a video that she posted like last night, and she made this statement that I thought was really prolific and kind of sad, but it was something that I couldn't relate to because it was about being a woman. And she said that like to exist as a woman is a prison at some point always. And she went on to pontificate about it, and I won't, repeat it poorly at this point. But man, I sat with that for a minute, and I was sitting in the room, and I just like watched this like minute and 30-second video, and my wife and my daughter were watching TV in the family room, and I was just looking at them, and I was like, I'll never feel that way. But I'm sort of glad that I just heard that, because it was in sort of a casual context. It was talking about just like the film industry and stuff. And it was, it was in relation to a movie, right? This is a movie content creator that I enjoy. And I was like, wow. Hopefully I gained something out of that I'll hold on to. But to have that statement, I think it's easy for a lot of people to react and go, that's pretty melodramatic. And it was intended to be dramatic, but also like, if you're not there.
When was the last time you dealt with that?
Or even tried to think about it from that point of view.
Yeah.
And that brings me to another thing that I think is interesting, which is the digital landscape affecting these things. How do we build our ethics, and how is that affected by kind of the perpetual onlineness of all of us, but like the more perpetual onlineness that we're seeing, the younger and younger folks, they don't get younger, they get older, but as more generations come up, they're online more and more. And again, trying to be ethically, I'm not trying to say that me having been online much less than my kids gives me some leg up, but it is going to be different for them as they gain that information and build those ethics.
We could never stay on top of all of this, just think about like AI. So like I think for a time we've tried to fight some of this like technology and the forward thinking of technology. And I think like we're going to have to partner, and how do we use technology as a tool, and how do we help individuals? And I don't mean just students, but if we're talking about students, is how do we help them understand the like legitimacy, the role of technology in their lives? And, I think digital media literacy is like really, really important. And I think in some ways we're actually doing a pretty good job of trying to address the ethics of AI and the role of AI. Well, it's just cheating differently, right? Like that's how we think of AI is in the classroom. And
it's the paper writer when you're on the faculty side.
Yeah, I mean, come on. It's like students haven't been, doing academic dishonesty for centuries. I mean, it's just now more readily available at their fingertips. But how do we partner with that? Like, how do we say it can be a tool, like not the tool, and help students like think about, and even I think even administrators, and I mean now we're reading about college presidents that are getting in trouble for just full on AI statements, and so like I don't know what the line will be, because the technology is so powerful. I do think we have to do a better job of helping our students be good consumers of the vitriol and sort of the attacks on online. Like I don't know how to do that. I'm not an expert in this area. But I do think there's a lot of ways that we can protect our students in at least educating them. We can't stop them from what they're doing because they're adults.
Well, it's hard because it's easy to get addicted to negative information, I think. And, even I've talked to, my own students here about like a similar thing where it's like, you might be really worked up about something and I agree with you about the issue or the thing that you're worked up about. Like we're on the same page. Right. But I'm worried about how worked up you are right now, because you gotta, sometimes you need a little less information. I think there is some truth to like, and my kids are better at this than I ever was, but there's so much information to process, and it puts so much worry and burden on you that sometimes finding a good way, and I'm not saying get off social media, that's never going to happen, and having that attitude I think is probably not productive for those of us who are a little older to a younger generation, but finding better ways to make your usage tenable and healthy for you. And I'm certainly guilty of doom scrolling too. I am not saying this from a place of somebody who's like, I've never let what I see on my social feeds stress me out. But I do know that when I step away from it, even though some of these problems might be real, they remain real, kind of the severity of them flattens out. And I think when you're ingesting that all the time, there's sort of a tendency to go, well, now you're closing your eyes to the problems and you're part of the problem. Well, you have to ask yourself, again, here's the ethical dilemma. Am I becoming part of the problem by not consuming much of it? Or am I making the ethical decision to protect myself? Because maybe it's a red flag and it really only needs to be a yellow flag, but you don't know because you're consuming so much of this thing that kind of gets you worked up. I think that's hard. How do you have a balance of that?
So hard. Well, I think part of it is how do we help people be good consumers of that? So, I mean, I don't think like doom scrolling just in and of itself is unethical. I mean, we all do it, and but how we're getting information, and I think that can be kind of dangerous. So we do a really good job of talking about like relationships, right? So healthy relationships, toxic relationships, and students go back to a statement you said long time ago, and this is long time ago, was when we were growing up, we probably were told how we would worship on the weekends. We heard lots probably around politics at the kitchen table, with family, extended family, friends, community. So think about it. Our students come to us with all these like ideas about this is the way I'm going to vote. This is how I'm going to worship. And then all of a sudden they're like, wait, this doesn't work for me. Like, this just doesn't work for me. And they're starting to kind of shed some of that. And we do a pretty good job at the university of helping them navigate that. Not indoctrinating them to something different, but like saying, okay, talk more about like why this doesn't work. Like, what are some other like ways you think you could worship if you want or not? We expose students to all kinds of different sort of political ways of thinking, or we try to. I mean, we have the tools to do that. We don't do a good job with the technology piece. It's like, how do we be good consumers of, be good critics of, and also, help us, like, it can be healthy. Like, you can have a healthy relationship with, technology. You can have a healthy relationships. Like, that's what we want. So how do we create that? I don't, within some sort of.
Yeah, it's sort of that big wild quandary.
Yeah.
I remember seeing, I saw a little thing online recently where somebody was showing the history of people saying no one wants to work anymore, and it went all the way back like 160 years. And it's sort of like, usually, we think we're engaging with a new problem, and young people a lot of times kind of get the brunt of that. But the reality of it is that we've been asking ourselves these same questions about people's motivations for a long time. We're always afraid the next generation is going to ruin the earth. But I think if we step back from it and we look at it, we've all contributed to its demise and to its grandeur, right? I mean, it's
and the world's like sort of like a pendulum, right? We were having some of these conversations, in the 1900s, and the pendulum is swinging this way, and absolutely, yeah. So how do we? I always think about this when I think about ethics is. Because we live in such a polarizing world, and we're talking about technology, and it's the information that our students are just inundated with, and us as people, as university people, and we have moved so far away from opportunities to have like constructive, deliberative debate. It becomes personal, and this is where I think we really need to educate our students online. Like I'm not on Facebook, but I know that, I've seen like comments on Facebook, and it's like, you're so not smart for saying that. And you must be, it's these personal attacks.
It's a very polite way to put it.
That's my really nice, yeah. Those are personal attacks about an idea that you have about the economy or, whatever, voting rights. And it becomes personal. And it's like we've moved away from that deliberative debate, and these are ethical quandaries. Like, how have we moved so far away from, if you don't believe in me, I can no longer talk to you, I'm not going to talk to you through this election season. Those are the things that keep me up at night, and why our students.
It feels like we've stripped the ethics out of it and just went to emotional reactions to kind of guide us.
Personal, and those blinders, and
Now, hopefully we can continue the good work of bringing those ethics to people so they can make those decisions. This has been a super fun
Talk about
conversation.
them. Thank you.
I think we've done it.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me. It was great fun on this nice morning.
Yeah, right. We'll pretend it's not raining. Thanks for stopping by the search bar. Make sure that you like and subscribe so that you don't have to search for the next episode.